Alright, hello and welcome to my Zombies deck tech. Unfortunately, we're not in Magic the Gathering Online. It is downtime right now, and due to prior commitments right now, I cannot, unfortunately, get that done for you. But I'm going to just do a quicker deck check here in the TCG browser. Pretty cool deck builder. You can submit any deck on here. Just have it on, have a link. I have this link permanently I can use in order to, link to a friend, or just I can save that link, make it a bookmark, and then I can just find it again whenever I want, which is pretty cool. It's kind of like Notepad for deck lists, which is really nice. So if you haven't done that, check that out. And anyway, getting into the deck, I played this deck at a classic this weekend to a top 4 finish. Did pretty well. Impressed me a lot. But it also has its weaknesses. Let's get into the deck. So the core of the deck is going to be Crypt Breaker alongside of Scrap Heap Scrounger, as well as Haunted Dead and Voldaren Pariah. Just to go over that a bit slower, you have the Crypt Breaker, which is your discard outlet, gets you Haunted Dead in the graveyard, which enables you to discard Prize Amalgams and Voldaren Pariahs. Basically, Crypt Breaker can win the game on its own. You don't actually need Amalgam or Haunted Dead or Pariah. You can just make 2/2s, start drawing cards. This mono black version is, I would describe it as, it is grindy, but it is a bit more aggressive than some of the other, like, red-black zombie versions. Usually what that means is I am just going to try to get a little bit of a lead and then stop using Crypt Breaker to draw cards and just start attacking my opponent for the most part, especially in a format full of Emrakuls and Avacins and Selfless Spirits that can flip. You really want to play a little bit aggressively, so Crypt Breaker is sort of your engine alongside of Smuggler's Copter. These two cards allow you to get cards into your graveyard. When you're mulliganing with this deck, generally you want a Crypt Breaker or a Copter. If you don't have a Crypt Breaker or a Copter, you probably need Sinister Concoction or Interaction in a matchup that is positive. So say I'm playing against Vehicles, you can keep a hand that has Grasp into Liliana. That's completely fine. Or maybe like a Scrounger into Liliana even. But we have the Crypt Breakers, and they allow us to discard Haunted Dead. Haunted Dead is important because it just kind of is your way of discarding cards efficiently. Like, Crypt Breaker costs 2 mana, and you also need to have a non-summoning sick Crypt Breaker that hasn't died. Smuggler's Copter costs 2 mana and also needs to attack. But once you get Haunted Dead, you can at any point instant speed, pitch 2 to essentially get Pariah into madness. Anyway, going along, we have Mind Rack Demon. Mind Rack Demon is kind of a role player. A lot of times in this deck, it's kind of scary because this isn't a Delirium deck. You don't actually, a lot of the times you have to cast it when you don't have Delirium, and you might take some damage. You have to be a little bit careful. But the trick to the Mind Rack Demon is it allows you to sort of just beat down a little bit, put pressure on your opponents in the right spots, and find relevant pieces. Because you do have Amalgam, Scrounger, and Haunted Dead all kind of want to be in the graveyard. So the Mind Rack Demon is just, a solid rate, a 4/5 flyer, trample for 4, also helps you hit pieces. Prize Amalgam is pretty much why the deck works. If you're using Prize Amalgam, remember that it enters at the beginning of the next end step. So that's important to remember because you're going to need to, if you want to play this deck, if you want to return your Amalgams, you're going to want to do stuff on the end of their main phase. So say I'm at the end of my opponent's main phase, what I do is I will discard cards to Haunted Dead to return it, get the Amalgam back, trigger to go on the stack. And what happens then, actually, is because you're still in their main phase, they're going to get priority back. So if you're playing this deck in paper, be careful. Because if you return a Haunted Dead and trigger your Amalgams, your opponent can then go back into their main phase and Declaration of Stone your Haunted Dead, or play a Sky Council's Flagship if they have mana. There's a lot of different things they can do to hurt you in that regard. But for the most part, you don't really get punished that much. Just be careful. Then we have Scrap Heap Scrounger. Gonna say this is one of the worst cards in the deck, but we are essentially a mono black deck. We don't have that many options. It's a card that can trigger Amalgam late. Part of the problem is a lot of the times the only cards I have in my graveyard are like an Amalgam, Haunted Dead, and a Scrap Heap Scrounger, and then you don't really want to ever exile any of the other creatures. But Scrounger is really good in case you play against control. It helps your green-black matchup, which is generally pretty bad. But it's just a role player card in the deck. As you see in the videos, I'll probably cut it a bunch of times just to, fit in some control-y elements for some matchups that are more aggressive, because it just doesn't line up very well against Reflector Mage, doesn't line up very well against, red-white aggressive decks. And then we have Voldaren Pariah, which is, it's funny because this deck is, I say that there's, the core to the deck, but it's really Pariah that makes the deck possible. All of the Crypt Breaker, Haunted Dead, and Amalgam, that's all fine and dandy. That allows you to get some free bodies into play, but you need a payoff for having all these random 2/2. Because, you know, if I put Haunted Dead and Amalgam in play on turn 3, like, yeah, I'm discarding 2 cards, and I'm getting a 2/2, a 1/1, and a 3/3. Like, that's not really that great of a deal until we start with the Pariah. The Pariah allows us to just win off of that generation, and also lets us instant speed discard, maybe to a Smuggler's Copter, maybe to a Crypt Breaker, maybe to a Haunted Dead. And the synergy with Haunted Dead and Pariah is just huge, because at any point I can, you know, flash in. Oftentimes you'll do it in response to stasis snares, or a lot of the times, and this is where it will separate you from being a good zombie player and a bad zombie player, is once you get a little bit ahead with a Pariah, oftentimes you just never flip it, because you get into a spot where you're a little bit ahead and you're just winning on board, and you have to force your opponent to react first. Because if I sack 3 creatures to my Pariah and they just have 3 mana up forever, they can stasis snare my guy, you know, they can harness lightning my guy, they can grasp of darkness my guy. There's a lot of stuff they can do. But if you're playing in such a way where you just force them to keep the mana up, otherwise they lose their team, as long as you're ahead, you can just stone rain their 3 mana. Oftentimes, my opponent will obviously have a stasis snare up or something of that sort, and I'm ahead on board, so I'm just attacking them. They're taking more and more damage. Eventually, they have to try something, you know? And that's really where the zombie player gets their advantage. So don't just automatically sack this into mana. As long as you're ahead on board, you generally should not sack your Pariah. Anyway, Liliana the Last Hope, kind of like a package, helps you get Delirium for the Demon. And this card looks, I will say one thing about this card is that it looks like an engine card. When you look at this card, you're like, oh, this card is in the deck so that you can self-mill yourself and get cards into your graveyard. But in reality, that is not why it's here. Yes, it can do that, which is why it's like, I don't think it would be in the deck if it didn't have the -2 and it had some other like -2 that wasn't graveyard synergistic. But it is here for the ability to just kind of win you games and control the board against creature decks like, you know, red-white and stuff like that. Liliana is very, very powerful against Veteran Motorist, and, you know, it's not great against blue-white, I said it out, but the ability to, like, tag a Selfless Spirit or keep a Thraben Inspector or Reflector Mage down so that it can't crew a Copter is really nice, because basically it just buys you a little bit of time, and then once it's bought you time, you can minus it. And the other thing it does is it helps your Pariahs be better, because it helps you kill, you know, your opponent's Toolcraft Exemplars, or your opponent's, you know, Pilgrim's Eyes, stuff like that. Keep that stuff off the board so that your Pariah hits what you want it to hit. And then, like I said, the minus is nice. You know, it can return stuff. It just doesn't mill quite enough to be that absurdly powerful. And then we have Grasp of Darkness. We're not playing red, so we don't get Fiery Temper. This is the best alternative we get. There are a lot of games where Grasp is better than Temper because it deals with, which is part of the reason I kind of like the black version, is while Temper is more objectively powerful, it can go upstairs, it can draw you free cards when you're looting it away. It's much better with, like, Haunted Dead and stuff. The Grasp can kill Avacyn, which is really big. It can kill a Grimflare, that's Delirium, which is pretty big. And it can kill through Selfless Spirit, which Fiery Temper can't. So Grasp is pretty solid. Like part of the draw to this deck, I know Andre Strosky played this deck to an 8-2 finish at not this Pro Tour, but Pro Tour Sydney, and he had Grasp, and that was Grasp killed everything in that format, like the Bant Company format, and now it kills pretty much everything now. So I like it a lot. Just the Wind, this is the difference between me and, if you look at the list from the Classic, which will likely be linked in my article, I have 1 Just the Wind and 1 Sinister Concoction instead of 2 keys. I find the keys to just be too clunky. They're too slow. Like, yes, it's nice to get a Pariah for 3 mana, but there are very few games where, like, you don't really want to play key on turn 2 because you fall so far behind in this format that's very tempo based. Like, the main decks are like Grimflare decks, white-blue decks, and then I guess vehicles, and then if you want to count it, other zombies decks, and you just can't afford to play a key on turn 2. Like, you're not going to win that game very often unless you need it to discard. It is nice to have discard outlets that aren't creatures, which essentially means if I have a Crypt Breaker and I have, you know, 2 Amalgams and Haunted Dead, I'm pretty stoked. But if my opponent has any removal spell I can't actually discard, that's what Key allows us to do. But that's kind of why I added additional Sinister Concoction, because every deck plays creatures. It's really nice too. This card is card disadvantage a lot of times, which is unfortunate. But the ability to start your chain is nice, and a lot of the times the discard is insignificant. So we're just talking about kind of like a terror on the stick. Just the Wind is sort of a cute card that I wanted to try out. It protects some of your cards, and also can be played aggressively, and can also lead to kind of like blowouts with Haunted Dead, where you tempo your opponent out, which is really nice. And then we have Smuggler's Copter. I talked about it before. One of your 2 engine cards. Really good deck. Like many of the other cards, the deck couldn't exist without it, but Copter is kind of where you want to be. Copter's interesting in this deck because usually the second one gets discarded. It's not like a red-white vehicles deck or like a red-black aggro deck where you have Pia and lots of cheap creatures where you can actually, play multiple Copters and crew them. Especially because Haunted Dead, is coming into play tapped and stuff like that. Be careful not to invest too much in Copters, because if they kill your creatures, then your Copters are just not crewed. It's not great, but I'm not saying the Copter is bad. I'm just saying that this deck isn't like a play 2 Copters and you win deck. It's like play 1 Copter, get some value off of it, move on if they kill it, go into an Amalgam or Crypt Breaker plan. A lot of the times if you have Copter, especially on the play, and Crypt Breaker, assuming you don't obviously have like Haunted Dead and an Amalgam in your hand, you actually want to play the Smuggler's Copter over using the Crypt Breaker, because it's just so much faster, so much leaner, actually lets you draw cards a bit sooner, get into your deck. Mana base, 15 Swamps, gotta love it. The mana base is almost perfect in this deck. 4 Sunken Hollow, 4 Choked, essentially 1 Island. Sometimes the island is awkward, but you need it for sideboard cards. Sometimes the Sunken Hollows are awkward. That's just how it happens. I think you need these, and allows you to hard cast Prized Amalgam, which happens a decent amount. I think in the videos I shot, it might have only happened once or twice, but that's going to happen about 10% of games, and it is actually pretty. It's weird, but just making sure you have a good curve in a deck that has no 3-drops other than Liliana is pretty important. Let's go ahead and look at the sideboard. We have 1 Collective Brutality. This is just for small creature decks, vehicle decks, the ability to kill their Veteran Motorist, kill their Toolcraft Exemplar while discarding an outlet like a Haunted Dead to look at their hand as well. Is really good because you want to clear out. Usually cards like Declaration in Stone aren't problematic, but there are games where they can blow you out by killing a bunch of zombies or 2 Amalgams with it. Want to just avoid that. Collective Brutality is very flexible, mostly for creatures deck. Deadsweight as well. The deck doesn't have that. It only has 4 1-drops, so when I'm playing against like any sort of vehicle deck or a deck with Crypt Breaker, I want to have that extra 1-drop so that I can just not fall too far behind, because I'm pretty much going to be able to turn the corner and win against most red-white decks. Distended Mindbender is for green-black. People don't really play Marvel decks anymore. It's been a while since I've seen them. They're just wildly inconsistent, but that's for, Distended Mindbender is insane against that deck. You can take a dig piece and also a Marvel with it, so it's nice to have 2 in the sideboard. Some people go pretty hard and want more, like 3 or 4 Mindbenders in the zombie sideboard. It looks like it's really good, and it is, but it's just not that easy to get a merge off this. Like if you're emerging off a Scrap Heap Scoundrel that costs 5 mana, if you're emerging off a Haunting Dead, that means you have to discard it, get it into play, invest discarding a bunch of cards into it, and then they can still play around Mindbender by killing the Haunted Dead. Obviously, Amalgam is the cleanest, but you don't always draw Amalgam, and a lot of the times, post-board, we're going to be playing against Stasis Snares and Declaration of Stones. We're going to be playing against decks that can't, like an aggressive deck that would just Fiery Temper or Harness Lightning the Amalgam, and the Mindbender isn't that great. But anyway, they're solid. Put them in your sideboard. Side them in against green-black and against pure control decks. 2 Kaladesh, don't be too trigger happy on this card because we don't have that much removal. It's not like my red-black deck where you're siding in you have a ton of removal with it. Just side this in against other zombies decks. Just side this in against red-white. That's pretty much what it's there for. It's not, don't want to get tricky and board in against Flash or anything like that. I'm going to group these together. 1 Lost Legacy, 1 Pick the Brain. This is a split that Tiago Saporito had. I'm not really sure which one is better. I think that Lost Legacy has its moments and Pick the Brain has its moments, so it's fine to split 1 and 1. Just basically for exiling, if you play against Marvel, it's good, but it's mostly, since that's not really a deck right now for green-black, you want to exile Ishkana and Emrakul from green-black decks. 1 Murder, additional removal spell, pretty self-explanatory. If you're playing against a deck with Avacyn, you might want another Murder. Revolutionary Rebuff and Spell Shrivel. I decided to just not play Negate at all because I think Revolutionary Rebuff and Spell Shrivel are just better. The ability for Spell Shrivel to counter cards like Torrential Gearhulk that Negate doesn't, and the other thing is Spell Shrivel comes in against green-black and blue-white because you want to stop Ishkana and you want to stop Avacyn. Those decks try to set up those big turns where they go Ashkana or Avacyn against you. And Spell Shrivel is like unexpected and also a blowout. Very, very strong. Would not cut these. Revolution rebuff, kind of solid, but it helps me not lose to Gideon, which is important. Helps me against control, which is nice. 1 Ruinous Path. I think maybe it should be more. This deck is very soft to Gideon, which is kind of unfortunate because the most popular deck plays 4. Sky Sovereign Flagship. This is for white decks. This is for your blue-white decks, your vehicle decks. It's possible you can side it elsewhere in like zombie mirrors and stuff like that as just a big threat. It's just really nice to have a threat that doesn't die to instant speed removal. It goes on your terms. It's like a 2-for-1. It's a card that they're not expecting, you know, they're not playing around. Anyway, that's the deck. I hope that this deck tech on TCGplayer's deck building tool was not that bad. Go ahead and let me know if it was that bad. I'm sorry, but I really have to get on a plane and there's downtime. It was poor planning on my part, so my apologies. Enjoy the video.